Okay, welcome to the Peaceful Prison Movement podcast. I'm here with a special guest, Carlos Rebollo. He's from a little town called Bridgeport in Connecticut, and we're here today to talk about his experience of incarceration and some of the things that he's doing now in community as he returns to open space and freedom to express himself and to be in his own way outside of those walls. Thank you so much for being here, Carlos. I appreciate you agreeing to take your time out today and spend a little bit of it with me.
No, thank you so much. It's an honor whenever I can speak about my experiences and bring awareness into the kind of experiences that I had while in prison.
Yeah. How long were you incarcerated for?
I was sentenced to 45 years at the age of 15 and served a total of 24 years and was recently released 4 months ago.
Wow, that's an intense experience. What do you mind sharing about what happened when you were 15, or what was happening in your life at that time that created this experience for you?
So, what's happening prior to my incarceration, or I should say, taking more responsibility, what happened prior to my attacking an innocent person and almost taking their life, is that I was born to a drug addicted and abusive mother and was raised around a very senseless and chaotic environment. And as a child, I felt incompetent. I felt inadequate to understand the world that was around me. And given that I was dependent on two people who were completely inconsistent and irrational, gave me the impression that I was the problem. And that all changed when I went to school and learned how to read. There was something now that I could understand about the world that, represented my capacity to, understand what was going on around me in a sense. The problem is when I would go back to my home environment, I would be met with the opposite impression. And so early on, there was this tension between what I loved about myself and what I didn't like about myself. And I had to decide, I felt. And since my home environment was the most palpable to me, the most realistic, because I could go to school, but I knew that I had to return home. But I couldn't go home and knew that I can stay at school. So I knew that that was my permanent place. And I decided that, I was going to try to do what my parents did in order to beat them at their own, violence and chaos. And so I started behaving very violently. And I remember the time that my mother was shocked at my actions. And it had to do with me selling drugs. And the fact that I can have that kind of power over her when she exhausted that over me for so many years, I thought it made me feel so competent. And so I continued on this behavior that was mainly for shock value. But then the idea started to develop, and then the habits started to form, and then the character traits started to solidify themselves. And, before I knew it, I was turned into this like criminal lifestyle that started to affect other people. And so slowly but surely, I ingrained myself more and more into this culture of violence and senselessness and impulsivity that brought me to, committing a crime against an innocent person.
Yeah, I hear you say you felt inadequate, and it sounds like powerless as well, like being in that environment. And from the experiences that I've had, or anyone has, really, like all of us between those ages of 0 and 7 are like the most intense, like learning of our growing, right? Because we're in theta brainwave state, which is basically like a sponge. Our brains just take in every piece of information without discerning what is quote good or what is quote bad, or what's productive or not productive. So like not even it doesn't even matter the experience. Like if we don't feel seen or heard, we don't feel that we matter. We don't feel that we have a place, and there's not the support. And then the feelings or the experience of inconsistency in what you're experiencing and what you're wanting to feel, I can imagine added to all of that, wanting to be even more powerful in that space and to show whoever was around you to that you could take care of yourself, or that you mattered, or that you were worthy of being in that space. Um, as you grew into these behaviors, right? Because the behaviors aren't you; they're patterns that we practice and what we learn. As you grew into it, like what were some of the things that shocked you about it, or that kind of took you aback and made you think about yourself a little bit more?
Yeah, so one of the things that stays with me is this impression that I got early on that asking questions was wrong.
Mm.
And, I remember coming home from school one day because I had heard girls speaking about their period. And
Mm-hmm.
I asked them, what is that? And they said, well, ask your mom when you get home. So I asked my mother, innocently as a child, I'm trying to understand. And my
Yeah.
natural inclination as a child to understand and ask questions is just not so easily curbed. So here I am, I come home and I ask my mother, and immediately just slaps me across the face.
Mm.
And that's just one example of many. And it repeated itself over and over. And these weren't hard questions, they were just very simple, innocent ones. And, I'm speaking from yelling to being ridiculed to being punished in various ways. And I just had the impression that, you know, asking questions is not a good thing. And what happened was I shut my mind down and I told myself, okay, if I can't ask myself questions, and this is not me as a child, this is me reflecting on a child. If I can't ask myself questions, then it means that what I'm perceiving is a threat. And if what I'm perceiving is a threat, then it shouldn't be acknowledged. And since it shouldn't be acknowledged, but I'm still feeling the result of what I'm seeing,
Yeah.
then the only thing that's safe are my emotions. And so, like I always say this, people have to understand that when they stifle the questioning, the natural inclination that a child has to understand the world around it, and to not take for granted, authority figures, parental figures, or any other person or entity that it depends on for guidance, the child is left to the mercy of his emotions because he has nothing else. If he can't understand the world by means of his rational faculty, his mind, which is trying to reason through everything that's being presented at him, then the only thing that's going to be left to him is his emotions. And so that was true for me. And that actually like reversed my world. It completely reversed my world because now everything that feels right for me, even though it's wrong, it's going to be right. And what's wrong, if it feels right, it doesn't matter how objectively wrong it is. All that matters to me is that it makes me feel good. And to my understanding, it's the right thing to do. So there may be a small acknowledgement because I have evidence elsewhere that this behavior is inappropriate. But nonetheless, I'm being driven by my emotions. So that's all that matters to me. And I just set this cycle, this vicious cycle over and over where my emotions will reinforce my ideas about what was right and wrong in the world. And I remember, I had people coming to me trying to help, counselors, psychologists, and all kinds of professionals. And they didn't understand that the position, the context that I had created within myself because of my emotions and the fact that I had shut down my mind and the fact that I was, acting out of shock value. When people were reaching out to me, it was reinforcing the very thing that they were trying to eliminate. And, in my mind, what was going on was, okay, you guys don't understand what's going on. This is confusing to you. Well, welcome tomorrow because I don't understand any of it.
Yeah.
And so, when people reach out to a child that has gone through that kind of violence, they have to understand and be careful of what they're triggering, where they're offering help, because to the child, like such as I was, it was putting me in a position of power because of the fact that I was powerless for so long. And I gained my power by trying to beat adults at what I thought was a game that they were playing with me. Because they
Mhm.
wouldn't grant me, my right to ask questions and to like question anything at all.
Yeah, yeah, that all comes back to that being seen and heard again. Like I hear that most when I'm in the prisons offering the classes that I offer for sound healing therapies and for meditation and self awareness. And I'm not very orthodox, and I'm not a very traditional, um, like gentle kind of what people would expect as like healing work to be, because healing work is messy and it's dirty and sometimes it's ugly and sometimes it's hard, and sometimes we just need to be real and call it like it is, right? And most of what I hear from people whenever we do these classes is that they're able to feel like they're not there for a while, right? It's not about escaping the space. It's about remembering who they are and really feeling into their self again and feeling seen and heard by themselves, and understanding that they're worthy of that space, and that it doesn't matter what other people think about them, right? Because what other people think about us is none of our business, has nothing to do with us, and it's never personal, right? Because whatever they are reflecting back to us is simply what they're working on, and we're all mirrors showing back to them what they're working on.
Mhm.
So when we create these spaces for people to reflect with each other, it can be anywhere, right? It doesn't matter whether you're in a prison or outside. It's the environment that we're tapping into, and the way that we are received, and or how we feel in it. And I imagine that as you started to come into that power in your mind, right? Like not even the brain being totally formed yet, right? That frontal cortex not even being formed until 25 years old. And I imagine at 15, like how frustrating or how scary that must have felt as well. Even though you're feeling powerful in your actions, it still is an unknown. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, no, it is. And, I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand what was going on with me. I just knew that there was a problem. And because I wasn't given an example of what responsible, healthy living is like, there was no way for me to take accountability. I didn't even know what to take accountability of, where to
Yeah.
begin.
How would you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I had made my mind a mess. My emotions were in total disarray. There was no connection there that I could identify between, what I was thinking and what I was feeling. I just knew that, there was this sense, this urgency, the sense of urgency to just react, to just continually react to the world that was around me. And,
Because
not so
that's
much
all you
as a,
knew.
yeah, it wasn't, and I
Mm-hmm.
blame other people because other people were making me act the way that I was acting. And,
Mm-hmm.
if I was angry, it's because somebody made me angry. If I was happy, it was as a result of somebody. There was nothing that was being created within myself that I could ground myself completely and then say, okay, this is who I am. And I don't necessarily have to respond to the
Yeah,
stimulus outside of me. No, if I identify something as, causing me or causing an emotion in me, then they were to blame and they were the object of responsibility there. And
yeah,
so I had to learn, um, how to identify what was going on within me so that I could ground myself accurately and take responsibility for my actions. Say, okay, somebody is causing something within me, but
yeah,
let me not take for granted that the cause is something that I generated by my ideas, by my beliefs, by my habits, and my way of interpreting the world. And when I was able to do that, then I was less reactionary and more proactive in my change.
for sure. When you entered the prison system, did you enter the juvenile detention center first, or did you go directly to adult?
No, so I went to a juvenile institution and I had to go before a judge to consider whether it was appropriate to pass my case onto the adult court. And he
Mm-hmm.
determined that my case was serious enough and violent enough to be tried at a superior court. And they charged me as an adult. And I went to the entire process, not understanding very much of anything.
Yeah,
Um, in fact, there were moments where the court itself um, would reveal how ridiculous it was to have me sitting there because I have a right, to my jury. I have a right to pick my jurors, to vet them as well. And so here I am, 17 years old after spending 2 years already in prison.
mm-hmm.
And I was told by many adults that, I had a right to, interrogate my jurors or whatever. And so I called my lawyer and I told him, listen, from now on, when you speak to a juror, come and ask me if I think that they're qualified so that I can take part in my trial. And the
Yeah.
judge is witnessing this and the prosecutor's witnessing this, and they have no idea of what's going on. But yet this is the position that they created by charging me as an adult. Now I have rights I have no idea how to exhaust. And I thought that was pretty indicative of, the contradiction of charging me as an adult at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you don't even really understand exactly what's going on, and you really can't understand. And I don't feel, in my own experience too, like in with other people that I've worked with, like there's not much of an explanation and there's a lot of inconsistency. And as a young person, like it's harder for us to understand sometimes if it's not delivered or explained in a layman term, right? Like there's all these different terms that people use, but it doesn't mean anything to us. It's just about, hey, can you make it simple so I can understand and participate in what's happening here? And I don't feel that that happens. Even when you are inside of a prison, there's so much inconsistency within the rules that they have there or how you're treated on a daily basis. And it begins in that courtroom and then it continues when you are incarcerated. And then when you are released, you're expected to do all these things, and to know how to do it and to gain the services and to talk to the right people. But there's so many people being released and there's so many people needing help that there's not enough resources for everyone. And so you're being set up to just be sent back. And a lot of the time, and I really feel that that pattern there within the prison system is something for us to consider as we are, the highest amount of incarcerated people in the whole world in the United States. There's I believe 1.2 million people incarcerated in the United States alone. And if you added up all the people in all the prisons in the world, it wouldn't add up to 1.2 million people that we have incarcerated here right now.
Yeah, it was when I say it was a horrible experience, people can't imagine what I mean by horrible experience. I don't mean the mistreatment of officers. I don't mean the unprofessionalism of officers. That does play into account. But for me, I mean, you're talking about a child that was removed from a society that deemed it uncivilized and unfit to remain out there. And
Yeah.
so they placed me in an institution charged with my correction. Now, mind you, I'm 15 years old and I'm still trying to understand, what does accountability look like? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm being met by people who have complete authority over me and are just far, far from the model of citizenship, accountability, things that they would deny me my freedom if I continually perpetuate it.
But they're not
Um,
practicing it themselves.
they're not practicing it themselves. So the worst thing that I want, people to understand is that when I began to make an honest effort at change, when I began to adopt these values of honesty, of integrity, of accountability, of independence, all of the things that are required for our humanity to thrive, not just for myself, but amongst, other people, they were not ready to meet me at that level. And so they would be frustrated, upset, and would even punish me when I demanded the same kind of consistency because I grasped, okay, at an early age, when I saw all this violence around me and I thought that the very best of what I love couldn't survive, what I told myself was, if this is what the world wants from me, then this is what I will give it. The problem with that is it ended up hurting a lot of people, and
Yeah.
it also ended up hurting me. But now I'm in a situation where I have identified clearly what's required of me, independently of what other people may do or say. And I'm telling myself, okay, if this is what the world wants from me now, this is what I'm going to give them, the very best, rather than the worst. And then to find myself in an institution that promises society that they're working towards helping me in that, and they're not, it was so demoralizing on a daily basis. And so I always said it, prison to me was not a punishment. I was removed from one environment and placed in a very similar one. So there
Yeah.
was no distinction there at all. I was thriving. I was violently thriving in that environment. But when I decided to change, the distinction happened where I separated myself from a life that allowed me to induce a punishment that humanized me by being responsible. And yet people don't understand that what the Department of Correction does, it undercuts that, it undermines that kind of punishment, humanizing punishment, and it doesn't allow perpetrators of crime to feel the full weight of their actions by way of being accountable to themselves, by having a structure that is consistent, that is accountable, that is full of um, true honesty. And it's very difficult to battle through that because like I resent the one thing I resent most about the Department of Corrections and the criminal justice system is that with the kind of crime that I committed as a child, I should fully grow into a conscientiousness that allows me to take full responsibility for my actions without having to point the finger at anybody and say, what about? And the fact that I could do that through all the laws that were changed and overturned and got me closer and closer to my release, not by any of my doing at all, but by society's reckoning with the fact that a child is not an adult and an excessive sentence is not appropriate to them, had me sitting on the sideline like, oh my God, this is crazy.
Yeah,
This is
there
crazy.
has to be the question of like, where does the rehabilitation come in? Because as a child, again, we don't have the cognitive sense to know. And if the environment that you grew up in is teaching you to be a certain way and gives you that example, then you are doing the best with what you know. And that's the reflection that you're getting back. And it's really it feels frustrating for me sometimes when I do go in, because I started this nonprofit last year, but I've been working in the jails since 2019, bringing the sound healing and self-awareness and meditation. And I'm realizing that there's funding for, vocational classes, or there's funding for chaplaincy and for religious purposes, but there's not a lot in the way of rehabilitation. And if there is, it's all volunteer work. The state or the federal government doesn't pay for it. It's not part of their budget. And I find that fascinating because it's supposed to be this correctional or facility of rehabilitation, but it is the exact opposite. As you said, you are being removed from one violent environment into another, where you are treated in the same way and treated as less than, fed horrible food, and not not given the means to do something different or to consider something different unless you choose to, but there's nothing in it that really is like encouraging you to. So what happened that made you consciously choose to start changing the behaviors? And was there any type of programs where you were incarcerated that supported some sort of like meditation practice or self-awareness or anything like that?
Yes, so I always love to read and write,
Mm.
always.
I
And
can tell by the way you speak.
thank you. And in the 8-year mark of my sentence, I found myself in solitary confinement for what would be the last time.
Mm.
And I started to ask myself a lot of questions. Now, remember, I stopped asking myself questions early on. And one of those questions was, if the world is the problem, like I believe it is, why am I the one that's always in trouble? And that put me in a position now where I couldn't blame anybody else. I have never asked myself such a question.
That's a great
And
question.
yes, and so it wasn't enough to change me, but it was enough to allow me to start seeing the world differently. And so there was a
Mm.
shift there. And I benefited from the fact that I wanted to get an education. And I knew that. And so I started to set goals. I started to set goals and I wanted to get a college education. So I got a job that paid well enough to allow me to pay monthly payments. And then when that job got too easy, I wanted to challenge myself. So I quit it, got another job that paid more money and was more challenging. And I started to achieve these small, successes. And those gave me more and more strength and more determination to continue challenging myself. And, a lot of people say, I'm bored because I have nothing to do, or I'm bored because, there's monotony. But I would be bored when I would plateau. And I would have to identify that it was, me plateauing. And I knew that I had to keep moving and keep challenging myself. And I was fortunate enough to meet two men who were engaged in serious and extensive rehabilitation. And they would read tons of literature and they would introduce me to them. And I would sit down with them and I would debate, comparing information, trying to find solutions to many problems, thinking about what rehabilitation looked like. And the programming, when I started doing it in prison, helped along the way, but it didn't help me in a way that would assure my success in life in terms of the challenges that were awaiting me once I was free. Um, their expectations and their standards were so low, and I had achieved very little in my life, that those small achievements to me, made me believe that I was ready to go. I've done enough time, I've done enough programs. You can release me. I'm ready for freedom in the world. What my mentors did was expose that information to me and tell me that I was being deceived and I was being misled into believing that I was competent through these programs, and they began to explain to me why. Now, a lot of people frowned upon the word criminal. I want to say why these two men and their program affected me so much by presenting me with that concept.
So were they incarcerated as well, or did they bring?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, no, they were incarcerated. They were
your counts.
cellmates for
Gotcha.
over 10 years together, and they built curriculum. They wrote books together. They
Wow.
challenged the Department of Corrections. These men were amazing. They stood out from everybody else to me, and I knew that, I had to just stay with them if I wanted to change my life. And so, you have this idea of a criminal that's underemphasized on one side of society, and then you have the other side that overemphasizes it. And they miss the mark, and everybody that needs the help that they need are standing in the middle. And so when they presented me with these books, The Criminal Personality, Criminal Thinking by Dr. Statton E. Saminow, a man who worked with inmates for over 30 years, I was blown away. I mean, this man was accurately pointing to many of the criminal thinking errors that I had, and also providing solutions to how to manage them. And I started working with these men and challenging those criminal thinking errors. And I began to see improvements. One of the things that the doctor recommends a lot is exposure. Expose your thoughts, expose your feelings, no matter how shameful they may be, no matter how crazy they may sound. You have to have
Self-awareness.
somebody else. Yes, you have to have somebody else to be able to feed back to you the information that you're given in a way that makes you reflect differently. Because when things are in our heads, we don't seem to allow for
Yeah.
differences. And so it seems like it's very accurate because it's so powerful when it's ours. But there's nothing more revealing than when we feel so sure about something and we pass the information along to somebody else and they look at us and they go, are you out of your mind? Like, no, that's not reasonable at all. And so that helped me tremendously with these men.
That's awesome. So they were with you, or you were incarcerated together for 10 years. Were they released before you?
So I met them 10 years into my incarceration. They had known each other longer and spent 10 years together in the same cell.
Oh, wow.
I served 24 years. My mentor, which is one of them, was just released after serving 25 years.
What is his name again?
His name is Michael Leibowitz.
Michael Leibowitz. I'm following him on LinkedIn. That's how we met, was on LinkedIn. I found you through the post that you had posted of him and his video, and was really impressed and wanted to reach out. And now here we are, which is very cool. I really appreciate your time today. What in what triggered him or activated Michael to start studying these different things? Was there any certain experience in his life that he shared with you in that time?
Yeah, so Michael was also a very avid reader as a young man. And what happened with him is that as he was reading in prison, he knew that there was an incongruency there that, didn't allow him to be settled with himself. And so he knew that a decision had to be made as well. He's reading all of these books. He's being presented with all of these knowledge that indicate a certain kind of person. So, in reading and in trying to put this information together, what he's telling himself is, my mind is effective. My mind is competent. It's identifying all of the things that need to be done in my life, but yet apart from the literature, in practice, I'm living something else. And so my mind is doing other things than when I'm reading. And so he had to decide, and he decided that, what he was reading and the ideas that he was developing were the accurate and appropriate ones. And what he was doing outside of that would not get him to what he wanted. And so he decided to be as consistent as possible. And that led him to a life of, developing this philosophy that he presented me with. And it sustained me to this day, built on, accountability, responsibility, respect of other people's rights, independency, so on and so forth. And then his friend, which is also my best friend, is still in prison to this day. He spent 26 years in prison. They wrote a book, they co-authored a book called Down the Rabbit Hole, How the Culture of Corrections Encourages Crime. And he recently, Brent McCall, who's still in prison, just released another book called Sham, which is an extension of that and delves deeper into the unprofessional and corrupt practices of the Department of Corrections. But where Mike was good at providing me with a philosophy of life, Brent extended that by allowing me to be an apprentice in the wood shop. And so he's a master carpenter and is amazing at it. And so he showed me that my consistency should not be limited to a specific space. If I'm going to actually think my brain into, frustration in order to figure out how to not cut my finger when I'm chopping something on a saw, then I should actually be able to do that in my personal life in order not to cut others or myself emotionally, psychologically, or any other way that it may be damaging to myself and others.
Yeah. So when you all were together in the prison talking about all these things, were there other people who were housed there with you that you had these conversations with? And were you like doing like peer counseling kind of classes? Because I was teaching a class up at Gatesville here in Texas. And one of the women who was in my group for the sound healing classes, she had created a curriculum and she was actually doing like peer counseling, and she created this whole program while she was there. And they were letting her do this, which was amazing to me. I didn't know that could happen. And I just thought it was really amazing that she allowed herself to expand in that way within that space and to share information and to create a safe container for people to express themselves that were all experiencing or the same thing and could relate. What kind of experiences did you have with like groups or anything, or what you were sharing?
So yes, they created a program based on many of the principles that we gather from the literature we were reading. Mm-hmm. And so they developed a program called the Imprisoned Program, and it's a cognitive therapeutic program. So they introduced the principles of the Dr. Stanley Saminow on criminal thinking errors. They introduce many concepts of self-esteem, taking accountability. All of the things that we were learning, they were able to implement in this program. The problem with that is that a lot of the participants would complain about the inconsistency of the Department of Corrections. Mm-hmm. And so they saw that no matter how much the participants were learning within that space, when they will return to their units and be met with a different impression by those in power, then they realized the limitations of the program. And so they decided to stop, the program completely and start writing that book, which will bring awareness to society in hopes of getting them more involved in reforming the Department of Corrections so that change could happen in a very effective and consistent manner throughout the entire state, rather than just within this room where we could, try to reach these participants, but then we're undermined by the very institution that was charged with rehabilitating them. And that's very difficult because, even in academic settings, and, I'm a student of Yale, I'm a student of the University of New Haven and other higher learning education systems. But there was always this impression where students will walk into the classrooms and they would say things like, okay, in here, my name is Carlos. But when you see me in the block, my name is 4/5. And so there's this disconnect there and this fracture that doesn't allow them to understand that what is creating is this idea that only in this space should I, think critically. Only in this space should I be responsible. But as soon as I walk out,
yeah,
I can do anything that I want in that
Even
instance,
goes. Mhm.
as irresponsibly as I can. And that extends to this idea that, okay, in the Department of Corrections, I could take as many programs as I want, get as many certificates as I can in order to be eligible for parole and make parole. And then when I'm out into society, all bets are off.
Yeah, that's interesting. Part of what I share in the classes that I'm offering is based on the books, and these are the two books that kind of started my journey 16 years ago into Reiki and sound healing and self-awareness. The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. Have you heard of this book?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So that was a big eye opener for me, right? Because if you're living by those four agreements, be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personal, never assume, and always do your best. Nobody can really mess with you if you're really living by those principles. And the other book that's kind of like one of my, and I call them my Bibles, and Bible to me is an acronym, basic instructions before leaving Earth. And that book, The Four Agreements, and then another book by a woman named Louise Hay called You Can Heal Your Life, were the two books that started it all for me and really gave me a different perspective on the world and how I was showing up. I was very aggressive and loud and in your face when I was younger. I felt like I needed to be that way to be seen and heard. And I moved out at a very young age. And although I did not have the violent experiences that you expressed and that you experienced, there was still the element of not feeling seen or heard, not feeling accepted, approved of, or loved in the way that I wanted to be loved in that environment, in the family environment. And so when at 31, when I came into these two books and met a wonderful man named Troy Bunnell, who was a beautiful friend and also a great mentor, and taught these classes based on the Four Agreements and Louise Hay's book, it really started to help me see that there is really no right or wrong in the world. There is no good or bad. There is no better or worse. It simply is. And in each experience is correct for each person in that space and time. So a lot of what I share with people, whether incarcerated or outside of the jail, is about remembering that whatever you do experience, or whatever you choose to experience, like you're talking about accountability and responsibility for your choices and the experiences that you have, is that we must remember also that every soul signs up to have an experience with you. We don't just happen into people's lives. There's a purpose, there's a reason, there's a lesson. And I find for me personally that over the years of remembering how to forgive myself, remembering how to love myself, was about remembering that everyone signed up, in my experience, to have that experience with me. And it's not about pointing fingers or saying that, well, they signed up for it and that's what was supposed to happen. It's not about putting it on them. It's simply about remembering that it all happened because everybody was there and it was an agreement among souls. And whether people believe it's good or bad is irrelevant at that point. Each experience is correct because it helps us to be ourselves in a more authentic way and to know ourselves in a deeper way. And so there's the science behind it, and there's the rehabilitation, and there's the looking at the behaviors and patterns, and there's also the energy of it and understanding or being willing to consider that even though society may deem it as bad, or we deem it as bad in the moment, or that something that is unloving, it doesn't mean that it's not correct. And that allows us to go even deeper into that space of forgiveness, or allowing ourselves to see ourselves in that way, even though we behaved in an unloving or inconsiderate way or violent way. That it's not that it wasn't, or it wasn't bad per se. It was part of the experience that whatever we signed up to have as a soul. So again, not taking away from whatever we do that's unloving, and to be accountable for it, and to also have this other perspective, and to be able to consider that we are whole and healed and loved, and that we are love. And if we are constantly looking at the good and the bad, or the right or the wrong, that makes it a little bit more challenging for us to consider letting them go altogether, like letting go of all the labels altogether. Because when we let go of all the labels, what do we have? We have an experience. And really that is the journey of life. We make a decision, we have an experience. And then we decide, or we tap into, how did that feel in my body? Did it feel loving or not? Did it feel fluid or did it feel tight? Did it feel tense or did it feel open? What was that feeling that I had? And listening to our bodies a little bit more instead of the screaming voices in our head that come from the ego and the analytical mind and the patterns or the neural pathways that our brain is practicing from what we learned when we were children. So for you, as you become more self-aware and as you continue to be more self-aware with all the conscious choosing that you do now to be more loving and to be more considerate of yourself, what are you bringing into the community now to further that and to remind people of their goodness and to bring the teachings that you learned with Michael and Brent inside to the outside?
So, interestingly enough, I'm finding a lot of great people that have been hurt, like really, really bad. Many by serving their communities, by this idea that their service has to come at the expense of who they are as people that have their own ideas, their own values, their own passions. And it's unfortunate because Michael, Brent, and I were three who did incredible change in our lives and contributed enormously to the lives of others, directly and indirectly by our choice to live more responsibly. And we were opposed. We were not only opposed by the administration, but we were also opposed by other inmates. And so nobody wanted to buy into our ideas and our philosophy. And yet they were in very dire straits. It was to us they would reach out to because they understood, no matter how much they wanted to fight against it, that we were doing amazing things.
Yeah.
And so to find people out here that are, creating change, providing resources and services to people in need, and to be attacked under this idea that their main purpose is to serve and not be seen or appreciated, affects me very, very profoundly. And so my message to them when I speak to them and I, identify them is that what I realize is that my most significant relationship is the one I have with myself. I have my own experiences, I have my own thoughts, ideas, and they could be just as terrible as to harm me before I meet my worst enemy, or they can be just as loving and great to make me fall in love with myself before I meet the woman of my dreams. And what I've learned about self-esteem, according to Nathaniel Brandon, and reading his books have had a tremendous impact in my life, is that we all want to feel competent and appropriate to life and to meet the basic challenges that it presents us on a daily basis. And so, we can say that, right and wrong is not the most important thing, but for us, it has significant life value. I mean, to be wrong constantly and to feel that we are wrong is to enter a state of nihilism that deteriorates our mental health and our efficacy and our relationships with others. And it creates a world where, there's no hope, there's no optimism. And so I understand the need to get away from these concepts such as right and wrong, because generally there is no consensus on it.
Exactly.
But in my position, in the position of men who have attempted and have taken the lives of others, it is critical and significant that they understand objectively that there is such thing as right or wrong, because other people depend on it. And so that has been my responsibility. And that's my message when I come out here to people. And I try to introduce to them how trying to figure out, what concepts such as selfishness is, what it means to live a life of morality based on principles, ideas that are grounded in reality when it comes to right or wrong. I want them to know that I was very reckless in the way I approached life. And the way that I changed my life was by sitting down and trying to figure out exactly if my ideas were those given to me by society, or are they ideas that I developed myself in relationship with reality. And so when we think about selfishness, I've always heard that word thrown around. It's bad to be selfish, it's bad to be selfish. But when I sat down and researched it, and I found the definition, and it says, to do what is in your own interest, regardless of others. I said, okay, wait a minute. But that begs the question, what is to my self-interest? What exactly is it about me as a person, as a human being, that requires me to be a certain way in order for me to thrive in terms of my self-esteem and my relationship with others? So I can't just willy-nilly claim that something is in my best interest when I know that I'm a living sentient being who can be affected consequentially by actions that I take. And so I can't claim that using drugs is in my best interest because I know what that does to my mind and my body. I know that I can't violate the rights of others because I know that I am calling on the same reaction towards myself, and that doesn't benefit me at all. And I know that I can't live short range because I know that my actions require long range thinking in order to plan accordingly, set goals, and accomplish them. And so, this idea that society placed on me that tells me, no, other people are more important than you are. No, I have to get it together first in order to contribute to the lives of others so that I have the right kind of energy to afford them.
Yeah. So
The right things.
selfishness is not being like selfish is self-love at times, right? Like finding what is most loving of myself in that moment. And that's what I mean by the right or wrong. Like what is most loving in this moment? Like it's not about it being right or wrong for me. It's about what is most loving of myself in this moment. And then we can also go back to the doing the best with what we know at that point. And if all you know is violence and aggression and not good enough, then that is what we will practice because that's what we know. So it's like, okay, well, how do we get back to that more loving space? And how do we remember that loving space within us if we have not had that or we were not taught that in the beginning? And then we go into a space of incarceration and we go into a space of lack of freedom. And then we're treated in a certain way too. Like, how do we come back to that place inside of that physical place? And that's where I feel that the program that you and Michael and Brent were sharing was met with resistance as well, because people were doing the best with what they know, and they couldn't grasp the concept of loving themselves. And that is a really challenging thing for everybody, because everybody's baseline in the world basically is they don't feel good enough about something about themselves. And we're all uniquely expressing it in our own way, whether it be through aggression, sadness, depression, happiness, joy, whatever the emotion or the feeling is. And so it's really, I feel like right now, and on my journey as well, has been about coming back to feeling. Like, how do I feel in this moment? And is this thing I'm about to do or say loving or not? And, if people are experiencing some mental challenges, mental health issues, they may not understand that either or know how to grasp that. And most of us, I believe, are able to really tap into that feeling. Like if my chest is tightening, if my body's tensing up, if things are not fluid, I can know that I'm listening to the voices in my head and I'm not paying attention to how I really wish to feel within that heart space, within that loving space of myself. So there's like gauges that we can work with and different questions we can ask ourselves. Like, what's a question that you ask yourself to bring you back to center?
It depends. One of the things, so when I was released and I enrolled immediately at the university,
Mm-hmm.
I was ridden with anxiety. I was ridden. I've never thought so much about quitting anything in my life. I mean, the unfamiliarity with the technology and so
Yeah.
many, people think resources is a great thing, and it is. But
You had
for
been
me,
removed from it for so long, though.
yes, not only that, but when you offer so many resources, like how do I know what to take advantage of? And not at my own expense, because time costs, and I can't do everything at once. And so to be presented at a university where I could go anywhere I wanted, depending on what resources I needed, and without knowing exactly what would benefit me, it
Mm-hmm.
was very it was
Overwhelming.
too much for me. Yes, overwhelming. So I sat down and I had to think to myself, okay, what is really going on? Like, what is the problem? And I had to allow myself the separation from my emotions that were giving me the impression that I was inadequate within that space. And I had to now use my mind. What are the experiences? What is the proven track record that I have in terms of putting myself in spaces that are challenging? And what I found was that my difficulty was in the unfamiliarity of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that when I became more familiar with everything, with the technology, and I would reach out to students, I would send them emails. Listen, this assignment is difficult. Does anybody want to sit down at a certain day and time and go over it together? And the students would reach out. Absolutely. They sit down, they would help me. And as I became more familiar with everything, I was able to identify that that was my problem. Not that I wasn't fit for the task of higher education outside, in the free world, but that it was all unfamiliar to me. And when things started to become familiar, I was able to identify, things that I was competent at and be able to apply them there. So everything just started coming back, my confidence, my sense of adequacy. And now I'm not necessarily thriving, but I'm comfortable enough when I could start pushing myself and know that more could be done.
Yeah.
So, in terms of that, I do it. But another thing is that, and I always tell people this, anxiety is my best friend because it's given me information about thoughts that are conflicting within my mind.
It's a
And
gauge.
so, yes, when we're in a state, that's what you mentioned, the word gauge.
Mhm.
When my mind is in a state of congruency, when there's an equilibrium there, I can sense it because it produces an emotion. And that's a consequence of the thought processes that are going within my mind. But when there's a conflict, my body also can't help signaling to me what's going on in my mind. And so I love it. I love and appreciate it because what it's telling me is, Carlos, listen,
Yeah.
something is wrong. Stop. Think about it. Try and reconcile it because the two things that are in your head right now cannot coexist. One of
Yeah.
them has to go in order for you to feel appropriate in this setting. And I love that there's an essay by the same author, Nathaniel Branden, called The Psychology of Pleasure. And he says that on the physical level, one can't help but feel what he feels because the body is automatically tuned to feed back to you the kind of stimulus that, is having an impact on your body. And so a smooth touch will feel great, but a pinch or a
Mm.
prick, will send these senses through your body that, hold up, this could be potentially harmful.
Yeah.
On the psychological level, we have the capacity by the choices and values that we use to set that mechanism, that physical mechanism in reverse. And so what can be bad for us, we can think it up to feel good. And what
Mm-hmm.
feels right, we can think it up to feel wrong. And I knew that I was in danger when I was in prison because when I started to do the right thing, it felt wrong. It felt bad. And I said, oh my goodness, how bad am I? And like, how bad have I gone that in trying to do the right thing, I feel terrible about it. And so that led me to to answer your question. Another example of what I do, to get me back to center. It's like think through the process of the thoughts that are going on in my mind.
Yeah. And the feeling, like listening to the feelings coming up in your body to let you know, like, hey, what are the thoughts in my head right now? What are they saying? Because that narrative or that dialogue that's on loop in the background that we're not conscious of all the time, that's the frequency that people are picking up on, right? We could be saying something very sweet or sounding sweet coming from our lips, and yet in our head, if we're thinking something that's the opposite, the person is picking up on that frequency and not the sweet words coming out of our mouth. They're picking up, are you an idiot? What's wrong with you? And you're saying, oh, could you do it this way next time? Like they're not getting that at all. So I really appreciate that way of coming back to center too, because I didn't really ever pay attention to what was going on up here in the background. I was just reacting from that gut instinct or that gut feeling that comes from the wanting to react and the pattern of wanting to react and only knowing how to react and being in that way. And not knowing like what the difference was, like to really listen to what was going on inside of me or to think that I was worthy of paying attention to me at that, at a young age and even into adulthood. My conscious journey didn't start until 16 years ago and I'm 47 now. So it's really interesting to just see like as we're younger and like you were reflecting on your thoughts as a child now and moving through that process of the legal system and incarceration and then now being free. It's really, it's also amazing to me to witness and each person has their own unique journey and all of them are correct. And we're not here to judge any of it, right? We're here to simply learn from each other and remember who we truly are, which I feel and believe we are all beings born of love. and that love is really the answer to everything. It is the solution. What am I about to do or say in this moment? Is it loving or not? Loving or not? That's the only question I ask myself. If I'm really like, if the voices get really loud in my head, I just stop and go, okay, hey, what's the most loving thing I could do right now? Or is this thing I'm thinking loving right now? Is it loving of myself? Is it loving of others? If the answer is no, that's the moment for me to shift or to change or to choose something different or to jump around and get it out of my body, right? Like to do something opposite of the energy that I'm in that moment. With all the things we've talked about, and all the things that you are planning and doing now, and all the things that you've already asked for, I'd like to remind you they've already been given. Like, really truly know that everything that you are wanting to create in this world for the positive and the loving upliftment of humanity and our incarcerated brothers and sisters, know that it's already given, and that all the work that we're doing together as a community out here on our own is amplifying, and it's growing, and it's building, and it's rippling out. And I want to thank you so much for everything that you do and all that you are. And I have one question left for you for today. I'd like to know how you see the criminal justice system changing in the next 2 to 5 years, or what you would like to see change.
That's a great question. I think that in my experiences, society is going to pay less of an automatic deference to these institutions that claim to be doing what they're doing. And I think that they're going to create a kind of system where society is going to be more involved in structures of power. And so what that looks like for the Department of Corrections is citizens holding those within those departments more accountable by having more transparency, more involvement, and more contact with officials. And I see that happening, and I think it's inevitable given the kind of government we live under and the reform movement and the wave that's going on. So I highly advise those in power to start actually catering to their responsibilities to society as they promise in their directives, because that's coming very soon.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I see big changes coming in the next few years. And the more I feel into it, and the more facilities that I sign on at and start teaching classes at, I can feel the expansion of it. I can feel the openness of it. And I can feel the people that even that are working in the spaces being open to a more kind space, a more compassionate space to be in, because you're already incarcerated. Like, that is the punishment. Like, freedom has already been taken away. It's not meant for you to be treated less than while you are inside those walls. It's about rehabilitation. It's about correction of thought or patterns and behaviors. It's about being aware, self-aware, and creating a safe container for us to be self-aware so we can change as we move forward if the things that we've been practicing to this point don't seem to be serving us or working out for us anymore, or didn't work in the first place. So I'm very excited to be in this space and time, and to be doing what I'm doing, and to know people like you as well, that and getting to know you, that are wanting this kind of change and are actively pursuing the change and actively working on changing themselves as well. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you, Carlos, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much as well. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.